Welcome, everybody. Happy June to everybody. Thank you for joining us for our June installment of the Idaho Department of Labor Labor Market Insight Series. My name is Craig Shull, and I'm the research supervisor for the department and your host. Today, for this June installment, we will be discussing some of the results from the Idaho Employer Climate Survey, which we conducted earlier this year. The report that we have for the survey itself is going to be published in July, but we thought we would provide a sneak preview for our webinar subscribers and give you kind of a glimpse at what we're seeing in terms of what the data is revealing from that survey. Joining me today are two of my fellow labor economists from around the state. We have Lisa Grigg, who is the department's labor economist in Lewiston. She covers the north central region of Idaho. And we also have Matt Paskash, who is located in Pocatello, and he covers the southeastern area of the state for us. Today, we're going to try something a bit different on today's webinar. It's not completely different, but just a slight departure from the previous 6 we've held. The panel today is hosting kind of a presentation / discussion instead of just the straightforward presentations we've had before. And as we present, the three of us will be kind of discussing the data. Mostly it'll be someone talking, but the two of us will kind of be asking questions on the fly. And we also invite you to join in this kind of semi-discussion format by posing any questions you have as we go. You can put those into with the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. For time's sake, and also because I'm a little nuts in terms of maybe trying to try this format, we'll keep it moderated, but we'll see how this experiment goes with a little bit of a change up. And a final note before we get started, this presentation is being recorded. We will upload it to YouTube for later viewing. We'll also be sending out a link to access the video, as well as a link to where you can find the previous Labor Economist Insight recordings, along with some of the other business webinars that the Idaho Department of Labor has recorded. With that, we'll get started. I'll just give a quick context of this survey and why we did this and what we're trying to hope to accomplish. As everyone knows, we've been kind of going through a kind of a turning point in the labor market. There's lots of changes that's been happening, especially after the pandemic. And while there's lots of good studies out there and some information that kind of helps us pin down on nationally what's happening in terms of how employers are feeling. We get really good data in terms of the labor market for Idaho, but there's some gaps that we've been kind of struggling with, and we get a lot of good questions from our stakeholders that usually there's just a gap in that data, especially when it comes to like remote work, or even how maybe how some employers are feeling on a statewide basis, that the national data just doesn't quite provide for us. So we ended up getting access to a new data tool called Qualtrics. It's kind of a really good survey tool. It has a number of things that come with it, but we thought we'd give kind of as a test drive, we would give this survey a try on it and see what we could find out from Idaho employers. And with that, we actually, Matt Paskash was actually our principal in implementing that survey. So I'm actually going to turn it over to him now. He can he'll give some of the stats on the survey itself, and as well as some of the top takeaways we're seeing from the survey. And then afterwards, we'll have Lisa kind of provide some context to some things she found interesting. And at the end, I'll give some information on the remote work data we found. So with that, Matt, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Craig. So before I delve into some nice charts and graphs for y'all, I do want to say that this survey pretty much was a team effort. We pulled together all of the members of the regional labor economist team to come up with a list of topics and questions of which we may have our own sort of intellectual curiosities of some questions, but also many times it's questions we get from our stakeholders that we just simply don't have data on. So we put this together with an eye towards being able to answer some perhaps very thorny questions of which the data is either lacking for Idaho or is just non-existent. So we put together the survey through Qualtrics. The email list that it was distributed via was a pulled list from sort of two large repositories of contact lists we have with the department, one of which is from our research side, This is what they use for a lot of their sort of more recurring products that we deliver, like our job openings and labor turnover survey that is done jointly with the BLS, as well as the current employment statistics program as well. So that's one set of email data points that we had. The other side was from individuals and businesses who have voluntarily signed up for our monthly newsletter and other media releases. So this is perhaps more of people who already have perhaps some interest or some real stake in wanting to learn more about IDOL services and other research coming out of the pipeline. So these together, we had just over 90,000 emails, unique emails that this unique URL link was distributed to. From that, we got back a bit over 2,300 responses, which gave us a response rate of about 2.5%, which does seem low, but for a completely new survey with pretty much no legacy to build off of, like say the current population statistics, the current population survey or the American Community Survey, which have a bit more name recognition, was healthy enough that we were confident going forward with the results we got. And while it did create some issues with weighting, given that the sample was perhaps not representative of the state, we at least were able to make some pretty broad generalizations for the state from like a 30,000 foot view, so to speak, getting down to a very granular level for different regions, different counties, or different industries. Probably would not be able to do much besides a few, which I'll show you here in a sec, where we had quite a lot of respondents, but for many corners of the state, probably can't talk much in very much detail about them. So jumping straight into our initial results based upon who responded at least. Give me one sec. So our initial respondents based upon industry, we had a pretty healthy sort of number of respondents from most major industries based upon their 2-digit NAICS classifications. Some notable outliers who there was very sparse respondents was mining. We only had 4. Administrative and support and waste management and remediation services, only 8. At the other extreme, we had construction. This was a very weighted sample in favor of construction in terms of respondents at just shy of 400, which would seem to be a particularly perhaps overweighting based upon what we know from the quarterly census of employment and wages and the number of establishments we know that they have in the state. Most recently, we have the 2022 numbers out now. So what I would say is that while there are some notable outliers and that they may be over or underrepresented in the sample of respondents, we at least were able to do some reweighting based upon industry to show you some of the further graphs and charts later in the presentation to sort of, again, give you perhaps more of a reweighted representative take on some of these questions that we tried to answer with the survey. So jumping ahead, there we go. So as to where these respondents were, well, it should come as no surprise that Southwestern Idaho was the largest chunk of the pie. Anyone who saw the recent census population estimate release for the last year would know that Southwestern Idaho comprises over 40% of the population in the state. It's also sort of the center of gravity for economic activity in the state, given that population and the workforce concentrated there. So that was not a surprise. And then the typical sort of pecking order of largest to smallest kind of follows what we generally see in a lot of our statistics, again, in terms of population, workforce, number of establishments. And so Northern, South Central came up as sort of close seconds, Eastern came up as third, and then me and Lisa's regions, the small people in the block, we came up there at 5th and 6th, respectively. Interesting as well, given that respondents could sort of check off which counties that they were operating in the state. We also had some that operated across multiple labor market areas. So that would be those showed in that graph in the far right with multi-region. So while while the again, the respondents were weighted in one area versus others, what we know from other data points we have to sort of act as benchmarks, we can do some reweighting to make this sample as close to representative as we can. So now this last sort of chart to sort of give us an indication of who responded. 95% of respondents were private sector entities, the majority of which being those in a privately owned corporation or other incorporated entity. But we also had a fair amount of proprietorships and partnerships showing up in the sample as well. Only about 5% of respondents were some type of public agency or state-owned enterprise, like our local school districts, municipal governments, state agencies, and so on and so forth. So for most of the results we're going to be looking at, this very much is going to be sort of generalizable to the private sector by and large, but again, we still had some public sector entities showing up in the sample. Now, as to some of the interesting questions that we asked on this survey, this one stuck out to us as we were trying to put together what we might call like general business barometer questions of what are your concerns, what's been your experience the last couple of years, and then what's your expected experience going forward the next few years. But in terms of what was their top ranked concern, just over half of respondents said some type of labor-related issue. Just under a quarter had said high labor turnover was their top concern of the ones listed on the right-hand side, while just under a third of respondents said that the supplier cost of workers was their top concern. So combine those two shades of green together, you got over half of respondents mentioning that some labor-related issue is their top concern in this labor market. And to put things in perspective, the survey went out in March of this year, which coincided with, if you remember, there was a string of sort of nationally recognized bank failures and questions about the financial sector in general. But despite those sort of relatively transitory events, labor remained, however, the top concern for a lot of businesses in Idaho.
Matt, did you expect any of those to be larger than they were? Any of those that were kind of small? Did you expect this to be a bigger piece of the pie?
Me personally, I mean, I often hear complaints about the tax code or other types of policies, incentives, or the lack thereof. I would expect that slice for taxes, regulations, and other policies, that purple slice, to be larger, but that didn't seem to be most businesses' biggest concern. Economic uncertainty, that gray slice, kind of was about what I've expected, again, given the timing of the survey with some national developments, which perhaps muddy the waters with a lot of businesses on their kind of what they were trying to expect for 2023. But otherwise, just I guess how prevalent the labor concern is, generally speaking, we as the labor economist team, that's often the questions we get. And I thought that maybe perhaps we have a bit of a biased view of the general economy as labor economists. But in spite of that, the large share of labor concerns across industries, for the most part, seem to be sort of it stuck out more than I would have anticipated.
It certainly confirms the anecdotal information we get when we're talking to employers. I mean, it's good to see this quantified in a way that, I mean, we're with unemployment rate and participation rate, those types of things. It's always, we get a sense of that, but in terms of getting that actual quantified input back from employers, I think is great for this. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of employers, I mean, with ChatGPT and other AI applications coming out, that a lot of talk of how much they're going to be displacing of workers and very disruptive to industry. I mean, we still need flesh and blood people showing up in some capacity to do certain tasks, or to do certain tasks which simply just cannot be automated, and probably will not be able to be automated anytime soon. Labor is still a very necessary input to the economy, and that's being reflected here in this chart. So jumping ahead, looking now at the turnover question, this is, again, a question that we often get from our stakeholders of like, why can't we seem to keep employees, or why is it that there just seems to be just so much churn going on in the labor market? Well, we asked employers to rank, again, the options on the right in terms of what is, at least from their perspective, the top reason why there's any type of turnover in their business. Anyone who had seen Sam Wolkenhauer's presentation earlier in a webinar series had learned a lot about the aging of the US workforce and the US population, and what consequences that's having with the retirement now of baby boomer generation, which for at least until somewhat recently had been the largest generation within the US workforce, now supplanted by me, the millennial generation. But in spite of that sort of very slow, glacial, but still very much there trend underlying the current labor market, retirements, however, were not the largest by any stretch of the reason for turnover in the labor market. If you look at the bottom two slices of this pie chart, the red and purple, combine those together, those are people who are switching jobs to go from one employer to another job at another employer. It could be working a similar job at another employer, like say if one of our labor economist team decide to leave and work for one of our sister agencies in another state. That might be what we would consider that red slice of the chart. If it's more of leaving to do something else entirely, like perhaps someone decided to retire and open up a bookstore in their hometown, we might consider that more of like the purple slice. But in any case, the job switchers in general, if you add them together, that's a little bit under half of respondents cite that as their top reason for labor turnover, which probably should not come as much of a surprise given, as Craig had mentioned, the record low unemployment rate, the sort of all indicators pointing to this being a very tight labor market in which workers have perhaps an abundance of options to choose from, and they're shopping with their feet, so to speak. But then followed up after that, the other category, which kind of is a bit of a catch-all, so can't quite talk much about detail in that. But if you jump to the next biggest category, yes, that would be retirements. So again, those long-term demographic trends are still there, but probably what we're mostly seeing right now is sort of just the churn of workers trying to find the best match for them in terms of work arrangements, compensation, and so on and so forth.
What stands out to me a little bit on this one is that almost 85% of respondents say that employee turnover is based on employee decision, not an employer decision. And that stands out to me that employers are only part of like 1/6 of it when you consider discharge, termination, and job change and promotion. Those are really the only two factors that employers have a lot of control over.
Yeah, that did stand out to me as well. I did look at those slices in particular, and in terms of the industries who were perhaps overrepresented in the gray and brown slices of the pie, construction, wholesale, trade, and utilities were amongst those where respondents were overrepresented. So perhaps in those industries, the employers still perhaps feel that they're confident enough that if they let someone go, they're going to be able to find someone to replace them. But on the underrepresented side of those employers initiating, sort of breaking that relationship off, so to speak, healthcare and social assistance, education, and other services, excluding public administration. So for a lot of those, perhaps more service-orientated sectors of the economy, employers are very reluctant to let workers go. And if there is a separation of that match between a worker and employer, it's probably being led by the workers making that decision. While on the other side, perhaps more of some other industries, which again, kind of hard to find the common thread between construction, wholesale, trade, and utilities. But for some reason, those sectors, employers still feel that they're confident enough that they can break off that relationship. So now, continuing on the thread of workers and the need for workers, we also put together a panel of questions concerning how do Idaho businesses assess the current skills possessed by their workforce, both presently and where they expect that need for those skills to be in 5 years. So this first chart, we've ranked these skills now amongst the share of respondents who said that less than 2/3 of their current workforce adequately possesses the skills, that you see along that left-hand side of the chart. And so combining those gray and orange bars together and sort of just consider that as just less than 2/3 of respondents said that those skills were adequately possessed currently. And so we see amongst the top of that list, with the exception for basic computer software skills, which I'll just talk about here in just a sec, but the rest, supervisory, managerial, and leadership skills, time management skills, teamwork, interpersonal skills, and problem solving and critical thinking, these are all what we might consider soft skills, or perhaps more abstract, higher cognitive skills that, well, one, probably will never be able to be automated, at least not presently, even with the advances in AI chatbots. But also these are skills that are very hard to teach in textbooks, and pretty much you have to sort of learn them by doing them and exercising these skills over time. So these are very much sort of the elements of the workforce that are perhaps the most human, so to speak. And they are all the ones that employers right now are finding the most deficiencies in, which really stood out to us. Basic computer software skills, given again, what's basic computer software skills to manufacturing is not the same as computer science, not the same as healthcare. It's kind of hard to make some generalizations of exactly what's basic software there. But for the rest of that top 5 or so, again, are these very sort of intangible skills, which gets represented again in this next chart, which then asks them to identify where do they expect these needs to be in the next 5 years. And again, we see many of these showing up again. Supervisory, managerial, leadership skills, time management skills, teamwork, interpersonal, work ethic now pops up in that list as well. So again, having a lot of hard skills, like very technical tasks being able to be completed effectively and efficiently, is still important, but I like to think of these skills, these sort of soft and higher level of cognitive skills, as sort of a necessary foundation to be able to acquire perhaps hard skills. And we see some employers, at least in this economy, willing to perhaps take someone on who may not be up to snuff with the hard skills, but if they have a good foundation of, can they work within a team? Can they take constructive criticism? Can they follow tasks without being micromanaged? Oftentimes that's a good basis upon which to acquire more harder tangible skills down the road. So this might perhaps point educators, curriculum developers, state leaders to sort of ask themselves perhaps how they might be able to address this issue down the road.
Yeah, this kind of confirms what, in terms of the soft skills, I mean, this even before the pandemic, I've been doing this for 10 years and plus. And soft skills has been a consistent need for employers. So it's interesting to see these ranks in this way, to me, that it really kind of confirms that from the Idaho's employers. And I also, I kind of take heart that on the bottom of that, the core education skills that employers need, while there's still some need, it seems to be that at least 2/3 or more are satisfied, even though there's still the expectation there's going to be that increase over the next 5 years. I mean, that seems to be like, just judging by this chart, it's sufficient at this point, I think, in terms of what employers are looking for. I think at least by using the 2/3 measure, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of guess what we considered basic even a generation or two ago in terms of educational curriculum. Now that definition is going to have to get broader and broader as the economy becomes more complex, society becomes more complex. What we need of our workers and our leadership too, we kind of have to broaden that category. And I think also too, which we'll probably get to later with some of Lisa's discussions about why perhaps specifically supervisory, managerial, and leadership skills are so deficient now, might reflect the demographic transition that we are seeing currently in the both the Idaho and the national workforce.
Yeah, and on this graph, I just want to say also, job, your icon went right there. Not all employers need job-specific Spanish. That's very clear in the survey result. But of those that do, there's insufficient skill attainment for their workers. So that's kind of an interesting data point there. It kind of explains that not everyone needs it, but those that do, they need more, basically.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that as well. Yeah, so it's with the US population growing more diverse, Spanish is really much becoming a very essential skill to have in a lot of industries. And so while it's still not prevalent across all of the economy, those who do need it, boy, do they need people with some functional usage of Spanish. So yeah, interesting takeaway there.
All right, well, I think Matt has reached the end of his little section there, so we'll switch over to Lisa and find out what Lisa found was interesting from the survey results. Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, good morning, everybody. From Lewiston, by the way. I just want to mention that Lewiston is one of the oldest regions in Idaho as far as our age. So if I were to show you Lewiston in this, we would probably have many more people on the upper end. But anyway, so we asked survey respondents to highlight up to 3 of their owners or leaders in the business and really asked them some very specific questions on these owners and leaders' ages, education, race, ethnicity, their title. We asked them a lot of overall results because we're trying to gather this data that, again, this is not readily available. And so this first screen we've got here, the responses ranged from a low of age of 15 to a high of 100. So just in our response, we have 85 years of span of someone who's either an owner or leader of businesses. And most of the teenagers ended up being in like family proprietorships, what I would assume were family proprietorships or proprietorships. Most of them had under 10 employees in them. Your older generation, similar thing. It was more of a proprietorship as well. But you can see the blue here represents our survey. And so when you think of prime working age of 25 to 54, the percentage of our responses at about 60% is really close to what Idaho's labor force is estimated at by the US Census as of 2021. Very close, but you can see that when we go under age 25, we're very much underrepresented and very much overrepresented at age 55. And part of that is that owners and leaders don't just happen at an entry-level position. Often you need some experience, you need some education, you need some time to get those supervisory managerial skills. And so it's not real surprising that young contingent is so underrepresented. I was actually shocked at how many teenagers were in the survey. The teenagers shocked me. I didn't really expect to see any teenagers, but there they were. Of course, I didn't expect to see 100-year-olds either, but they were. So age 55 plus, as you can see, we have about double the level of business leaders represented than you would expect in Idaho's labor force. So with a median age of Idaho's labor force is about 40. In this survey, the median age of our leadership was about 50. So we're about a decade higher. But 55 plus though is also probably more so than I would expected, just because I think there are some of those proprietorships that are having a hard time, possibly with the next generation coming up and things, people are hanging in there a while. But overall, it just shows that we have this high skew towards high age in our leadership. And when those people retire, there's going to need to be people to replace and fill them.
I still think it's amazing. We had someone that said they were 100 years old and responding to the survey as a business leader.
Honestly, it floored me. I immediately saw that and I messaged Matt and I was like, did you see this? Did you see this? And it floored me, but there are some industries and some people that's their passion in life and they choose to continue it. And hats off to you.
Yeah.
If you can do it. So looking at age ranges, if I had taken the total level of responses for each age range, construction, because of its huge skew in the number of responses we would have been the #1 industry in the 3 lowest age brackets here. Age 70 plus, it would have went 3rd, so it would have showed up on all of my age groups. So what this actually is this is showing you my overweights. So the percentage of responses in this age group by industry compared to our total survey responses. And so you can see for those under age 30, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services are the 2 main ones. And these both had about 2 times the level of responses in leadership than what we had overall in the total survey industry responses. So younger leaders, but also in industries that you think of where younger people start out. So your restaurants, hotels, whitewater rafting, you think of them kind of being a younger generation. And then when you look up again in the upper level, we've got wholesale trade, and then we've got agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. We're told that the average age of farmers is about 70 years old in the US right now. And so seeing that up there kind of confirms that, going, okay, that makes sense. But what was interesting to me about this is that there's not a lot of overlap in the industries. A lot of the industries kind of showed distinct highlights in certain age groups, which I expected more duplicates of.
Oh, really quick, can you go
Sorry.
back to that? I mean,
can.
also one thing that I think was curious to me was seeing in those sort of 30 to 49 healthcare, given that, I mean, especially if you're like an executive nurse or someone else who perhaps have both a history as a practitioner and in leadership. I mean, you already have to spend considerable time in schooling to become a practitioner, and then perhaps if you transition to a leadership role. And for many in that bracket, I'm surprised to see many folks in leadership in healthcare. When I typically think of healthcare leaders, I typically think of people much older than that even. So I guess that stood out to me.
I was shocked to see that too, but when I start thinking of just the huge range of healthcare, I mean, there's, assisted living facilities, there's hospitals, there's clinics, there's dentist office. But yeah, it takes a lot of schooling for a lot of these occupations. But a lot of people also just kind of are able to retire early too. They kind of go in, they stay in, and you don't see a lot. There's not as much industry switching potentially either with healthcare as there are with others, as it's so specialized, some of the skills that you have there. But yes, I was very interested to see that too. I expected that to be kind of more in the age 50 to 69 bracket showing up. But 30 to 49 is where it stood out at. Okay, so now going on to gender. Approximately 25% of our survey responses did not answer this question. So based on those 75% that did, for what we saw, total owners and leaders, so again, we asked up to 3 owners and leaders to be represented. Some respondents only highlighted 1, some people responded 3. Again, 25% did not respond to any of them. So other responses, you can see that men were just under 60% of our responses. Women were just under 40%, and then we have non-binary or gender not conforming and prefer not to respond, making up almost 2%. So very much skewed a little bit on the heavier side towards males. So this number is looking at, so this last chart consolidated all of the answers. This one is based on an entity. So if an entity responded that they had all females in their leadership, they went in the females only. If they responded that they had a man and a woman, they went into mixed gender. And so what we see here is that we do see more males only leaderships than we do females only. I do want to mention that more than half of each of both the females only and males only were sole proprietorships, and that they were the only responses in that. So it was single person leadership that was highlighted. So that makes up a good portion of those. But mixed gender is still by far the most common, what you're going to expect to see. By the way, construction made up almost half of all of the males only. Again, we had a huge contingent of construction responses, but it made up less than 5% of the female only entities, which I thought was interesting and fascinating. Okay, so again, here's based on that same overweight criteria that we saw before. So this is not total responses. This is how the percentage of responses within each class compared to our total survey results. And so females, you can see, are overweight education, healthcare, professional, scientific, and technical services, which can include lawyers, accountants, photography studios, veterinarians, and then males only, again, construction, wholesale trade, and ag, forestry, fishing, and hunting. When I broke it down by regions, so this is where at least one owner leader in the entity was male. And so you can see Idaho statewide, we're just under about 80% of entities that responded by gender had a male present. You can see the highest is on the eastern side. Tried to color code this a little by region. Your blues are eastern, southeast. Your greens are the north. And the orange hues are southwestern and south central. And you can see that my region, South Central, has the lowest percentage of at least male with 71%. So not a real huge range here. We're about 70 to 80% for all 6 regions. Again, there may be some sampling error going on there, but statewide around 80%. A little bit lower when we look at least having one owner or leader female. So Idaho statewide, we're at about 63%. And one thing, of course, I have to point this out because this is where I'm from, is North Central is leading the pack here. Of the respondents, or at least we had 75% of entities that responded that had at least one female in their owner or leadership role. Southeastern was the lowest at 55%. When we look at ethnicity, the main question was whether this owner or leader was of Hispanic ethnicity, yes or no. And so what you can see is that 14% of them were Hispanic and 86% of them were not. Seems like a very low number until you look at our total Hispanic population in the US, again, estimated by the US Census in 2021. Idaho is about 13% lower than the US in general at 19%. So seeing that 14% of owner leadership versus potentially 13% of the population, I was actually really interested that it was that close to population estimates. I did not finagle the numbers like that. I promise. I figured out them all separately. But the way to see them connect and combine was really fascinating to see that we may have a similar level of leadership that reflects an ethnic Hispanic culture as not. Again, when we look breaking this up by what type of business type those Hispanic leaders are in, you can see that the blue is my Hispanic, and they are overweight the most privately owned corporations. But then compared to the survey responses, they are overweight proprietorships for the main part. So those make up a larger portion than our overall survey responses.
And that kind of parallels what you had found with the women in leadership tend to be concentrated in a lot of proprietorships as well.
Yes.
So it seems like a lot of perhaps minority groups seem to be leaning towards proprietorships as sort of the avenue for business leadership.
Yeah, almost 2/3 of my women only were proprietorships. So they were the only woman that was represented in that leadership role. I don't think it was quite so high here, as you can see, but there was definitely a skew towards it. So top 5 industries where we saw Hispanic owners and leaders: construction, of course, but I do want to point out that construction is overweight compared to total survey responses. So 22% versus 17%. Following that, we have healthcare, professional, retail, trade, and other services. Very similar, actually, to total survey responses on the rest of them. When we look at race, the question was, does this person identify as white, prefer other race, 2 or more races? And then the one you can see on the far left, which puts all the American Indian together with Black or African American, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander. That made up 4% of survey responses. Compared to our total population by the US Census, the white number on the right side is a little bit overweight. This about 90% of business leadership was white classified versus about 81% versus what you would expect to see in the survey population by the census. But the American Indian, Alaskan Native, Black, and Hawaiian were very close to what our population looks like as well. But our population says almost 10% 2 or more races as well in the census. So some of those may have been in the prefer not to respond or answered in a different way as well for that question. But overall, very small racial representation. But we also have a small representation in our population. So they were actually very similar to total population numbers, which was interesting as well. Okay, and with that, I'm going to send it to Craig to talk about remote work.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Nice work. All right, I will share my screen here. Okay. So, all right. So one of the questions.
I think,
I'm sorry. Hold on.
yeah, there we go.
Okay, now you have control.
Thanks. All right. It's not. I mean, it's a good thing we don't have AI yet doing this. All right. So one of the big questions, and actually one of the things driving this survey was the question about remote work. We intend to study this a little bit further, but in terms of this climate survey, we at least wanted to get a gauge on what employers were experiencing and what arrangements they had for people working remote, hybrid, or kind of a combination of working from home, remote, or in the office. There's certainly been lots of articles being written on this, something that it seems like it's kind of contentious a little bit, but with the labor market kind of being as tight as it is for labor force, it's certainly a factor that isn't going to go away for quite some time. In fact, it's probably here to stay in one form or another. But what are kind of focusing on some concentrate. I have 2 slides for you on this one. This one is kind of concentrating on a few industries and then the aggregate for all the industries that are reported. It looks like it's about 89% of all industries in Idaho, at least in terms of the employers that responded to this. 89% require in-person work, and about 11% has either remote or hybrid working arrangements. And it's, it's the nice thing about this survey is we are able to separate this by industry in terms of kind of getting a gauge on who is remote working most and what that makeup looks like. At the top, we kind of have 2 industries. In fact, the only 2 industries that have a minority of in-person work arrangements for the state. That includes professional, scientific, technical, and information, which kind of makes sense because those industries are concentrated mostly on transferring information, analyzing those types of things. So it kind of fits with a remote or hybrid type of work. Of the 2, actually, the top professional, scientific, technical actually has a majority of remote. And then some portion is doing hybrid, and then just about 29% that's working in person. Information a little bit less in terms of remote, but still a large chunk. But when you take together the remote and hybrid, it's also a majority of its workplace arrangements. And then you have finance and insurance. There's kind of it starts getting a little bit more on the in-person. And then what's interesting is public administration. That's the industry obviously we're in, and my crew and I myself have a hybrid relationship, so it kind of fits with what we're seeing here. But very few reported a remote fully type of. In fact, it doesn't even show up on this graph very well, but there's a tiny sliver. It's 14% that has a hybrid, but by and large, 85% are in-person work in terms of public administration. And then we have, in terms of comparing these with all industries, it's 89% on it. And on the next slide, I'll kind of show you how it's a bit busy.
Did you expect the total industry number to be at that level, or what were you expecting?
That's a good question. And actually, I was going to ask you guys that too. So way to beat me. Actually,
sorry.
No worries, that's fine. I stole Matt's thunder earlier, so you're fine. I was actually expecting, I didn't really know exactly what to expect. Like I said, the data we were getting was from census, the pulse survey. It kind of seemed to say about 7% was remote, but every time I ask this or answer this question or talk about it, I always let people know I never liked how the remote question was asked for that. It always was asked in terms of due to COVID related reasons or health that there was remote work. So it kind of didn't really transition to kind of a permanent situation. For me, I was kind of surprised it wasn't more for all industries, but it kind of makes sense given the size of the industries we're looking at here. I mean, retail, trade, and even healthcare, even though it's a little bit above the total, those are the biggest industries. So that makes sense in terms of that's where they're lining up. It also makes sense in terms of how, there's definitely a correlation with kind of what the industry is dealing with in terms of how it delivers its its service or goods, or if it makes it, if it's going to have what weight of remote and hybrid it'll have. So you certainly have on the one end of the extreme is mining, which is practically, it's 99% work in person and a slight, like less than 1% reporting a hybrid situation, no remote at all. But then also these accommodation, food service, agriculture, fishing, farming, arts, recreation, entertainment, retail, construction, those are all required in person, even those, I mean, even manufacturers automation requires people to be there. So I'm really kind of surprised that. Let me turn that back to you. What did you guys find in terms of looking at this data when you were looking at it?
I think for me, it wasn't much off the mark than what I was anticipating in terms of the share who were offering some degree of remote or hybrid work arrangements. I know that we probably won't expect the numbers to be what they were in 2020 or 2021, the middle of the peak waves of the pandemic, when very much this was sort of like a practical necessity. But even with now the pandemic, for the most part in the rearview mirror, and we're seeing some return to what had been sort of the pre-pandemic trend, I do think there's going to be some things in the Idaho economy, the national economy, have permanently changed now that employers know that perhaps it's not the end of the world to not have people in the same spot, the same office, 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. Now, of course, there's a lot of, I guess, divergent expectations between what employers want and what employees want. So I guess it's anyone's guess as to where it's going to go from here. But yeah, it kind of was about what I was expecting, and the industry sort of breakdowns also kind of were about what I was expecting. I guess for me, that was the shock that there wasn't much that was news to me. But again, that's kind of what we do for our jobs as the labor economists, is that we kind of always have an ear to the ground to these things. So
yeah. I was still kind of surprised at the level, the ratio of the top two. I wasn't expecting that degree myself, but kind of makes sense with some of the things you see with how this remote work is affecting other areas, like with, I think the New York Times had an article that kind of compared the empty office space in the inner cities and to some extent remote work. And actually one of our economists at the conference board colleagues had kind of termed a donut effect, where people are moving outside the inner cities because of what the capabilities of remote work. That's not an issue that we're seeing here. We're still, I mean, housing, property, people moving, it's still, actually we're a benefit of that donut effect instead of being kind of subjected to it in terms of people leaving. So, all right. So Lisa, Matt, do you have any kind of concluding thoughts, comments, or anything you'd like to impart that before we close it out?
Well, I will say that what we're giving is perhaps just a slice of a much larger pie, so to speak, of what all we found in the survey. These are, I guess, the most interesting tidbits we got out of it. One of the other questions that we had asked was asking, at least for employers, what's been your experience the last 3 years, and sort of just kind of taking that as sort of like an idea for the pandemic years and sort of all the roller coaster ride that we've been through since 2020. And then also ask them where they expect to be in the next 5 years. And one of the interesting tidbits we got out of it is that, or perhaps shouldn't be surprising, that entrepreneurs by their nature tend to be optimists. And so everyone expects to grow in terms of their employment over the next 5 years, or at least I'd say everyone, a solid majority, very large majority. But of those who expect to grow, typically they're the ones who seem to have managed to grow in the last 3 years, despite all the roller coasters we've been on. Those who expect to perhaps shrink tended to be those who have already shrunk the last 3 years. So it seems to be that whatever your experience had been throughout COVID, the supply chain shocks, and many geopolitical events worldwide, it very much seems to be informing where businesses think they're going forward over the medium term. So that was one interesting takeaway. But again, I guess the real interesting tidbit to me was just how much optimism there still was, despite how hard it is to find workers, how hard it is to keep workers, how hard it is to sort of weigh all these economic uncertainties. Many businesses still seem to be on the brighter side of expectations.
Yeah, and one thing that stood out for me, kind of piggybacking on that, was that when we asked employers if they had jobs that were open that were longer than a month, almost 2/3 of all of our responses had their jobs that were open still a month later. And so it's not just a local problem, it's a state problem, it's a national problem. There's a lot of reshuffling going on. And the beautiful thing about the survey was this is kind of real-time data. A lot of the data we get is 1 or 2 years old, and we don't have the full feel of what happened and how things have changed. And so this was really an up-to-date way to try to get a pulse of Idaho's employers and really figure out what they're struggling with. And maybe there's ways that we can help in some of it, and maybe there's ways we can't, but being aware of it, I think is useful too.
Those are good points. Yeah, and I think this having this survey helps answer those questions that we didn't have data for, but also the ones we do. That's a good point to mention that a lot of times it's lagging data, so it certainly allows us to kind of get more of a real-time sense of what Idaho employers are feeling. So with that, we'll also remind you that our report is due to be published next month. Our next one is scheduled for July 11th, and we tentatively have Seth Harrington scheduled. He's right now looking at kind of exploring work apprenticeships. So hopefully we'll learn some things about that when he gives his presentation next month. We'd also like to remind you the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared toward job seekers, employers, but it also includes free access to labor market information like what we've just been talking about. If you go to lmi.idaho.gov, you can find a variety of dashboards as well as a page dedicated to the regional information and a directory that will lead you to one of our 6 labor economists located around the state. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending, and good day, good luck, and have a great summer, everybody.